They said Maple Hollow was a dead town, a place where no one dared to live, and no one ever came back. But one autumn evening, a weary veteran named Jack Walker drove his old truck into the valley, with nothing left but a loyal dog named Ranger and a heart still haunted by silence. People said the land was poisoned. They said nothing could grow there again. But what if they were wrong? What if some places are not cursed, only waiting for someone brave enough to listen? What if God still works quietly through broken hands and forgotten towns? Tonight, you will see how one man and his dog turned a ruin into a miracle. Sit back and let the story warm your heart. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The air in early autumn drifted soft and dry over the hills, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and old leaves turning gold. The sun fell low behind the ridge, spilling slow light across a town that had forgotten his name. Dust hung in the air above the road as Jack Walker drove his faded blue pickup toward the edge of town. The sound of gravel under his tires was the only rhythm he had known for weeks. He stopped near the lumber yard, where the smell of resin and sawdust mixed with the chill of evening. Jack was 45, though years of sun and war had written older stories on his skin. His hair, hazel brown with threads of silver, curled slightly at the ends when the wind moved through it. A thin beard traced the line of his jaw, trimmed short as if out of habit from a life that no longer existed. He wore a weathered brown jacket, one elbow patched, over a gray shirt faded by time. His jeans were frayed at the knees, boots scuffed and cracked. Nothing about him looked careless. He carried the quiet discipline of a soldier, the kind who remembered every sound that could have meant danger. His eyes were steady but tired, the kind that once searched for movement in the distance and now searched for peace. Beside him, in the passenger seat, sat Ranger, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a sable coat that gleamed copper in the afternoon sun. Ranger's eyes were amber, intelligent and alert, scanning every movement on the road with the instinct of a working dog who had never forgotten his training. His right ear had a small notch, a scar from a mission overseas, and the fur around his muzzle was just beginning to pale. To Jack, he was more than a dog. He was the last soldier who had stayed. Jack parked behind a stack of lumber and stepped out. The boards creaked under his boots. He reached into the truck bed for his work gloves, the ones with holes at the fingertips, and joined the other men loading timber into a truck bound for the next town. They nodded in greeting, but said little. Most of them had learned that Jack preferred silence. In a small town like Maple Ridge, a man's past traveled faster than his words. People whispered that he had served 20 years, that he had medals he never talked about, that he lived alone with a dog who seemed to understand too much. None of them were wrong, but none of them really knew him either. He lifted the planks with careful rhythm, his muscles remembering motion better than his mind remembered peace. The smell of sawdust clung to his jacket. The supervisor, an older man named Carl Benson, shouted from across the yard. Carl had worked at the mill since he was a teenager, a big man with a round belly, rough hands, and a sunburned neck. He treated his workers fair, though his temper was sharp when orders were late. Carl respected Jack because he never complained, never asked for favors, and always stayed until the work was done. When the shift ended, Carl nodded once toward him. Jack returned the gesture. Nothing more was needed. As the others drove off, Jack stayed behind, sitting on the tailgate of his truck. The late afternoon breeze stirred the dust again, and a line of geese passed above the sky, heading south. Ranger hopped up beside him, resting his chin on Jack's knee. Jack scratched behind the dog's ear, the small notch rough under his thumb. For a long moment, he said nothing. He watched the color drain slowly from the horizon until the world turned the color of smoke. Then quietly, he spoke as if to himself. Sometimes the hardest thing is to live after you stop fighting. Ranger's tail flicked once against the metal, a silent answer. When night came, Jack drove back to the small cabin he rented near the edge of town. The cabin sat by a narrow creek, lined with willows, their branches whispering against the glass when the wind blew. The floor creaked in protest every time he crossed it. The walls were bare except for a folded flag in a wooden frame and a single photograph on the table, a group of soldiers standing in desert light, faces blurred by dust and memory. One of them, smiling wide, had his arm over Jack's shoulder. That was Luke Turner, the man who once pulled him from the wreckage of an ambush and laughed through a mouthful of blood. Luke had died 6 years ago. Jack still heard his voice sometimes in his dreams, giving orders no one else remembered. He made coffee on the small stove, the same bitter blend he drank in the service. The smell filled the cabin, sharp and grounding. Ranger lay by the door, paws crossed, eyes half open, but always alert. Jack sat at the table, staring at the steam curling above the cup. He thought of how quiet the town was at night, how the stillness pressed against the walls until even the ticking clock seemed loud. The quiet should have been peaceful, but for Jack, it carried a pulse, an echo that never truly faded. It was the same silence that came after explosions, after the shouting stopped, the kind that made him remember. He rubbed the scar on his left wrist, a faint line from shrapnel long removed. Some nights, he traced it without realizing, as if confirming he was still here. Ranger lifted his head, ears tilting, sensing the shift in his breathing. Jack met the dog's gaze and tried a smile. "We made it through worse, didn't we?" The words were low, almost a sigh. Ranger rose, patted over, and rested his head on Jack's thigh. Jack's hand moved to the dog's neck, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath the fur. For a moment, it anchored him. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through dry leaves, whispering along the creek. The moon hung pale and high, casting silver lines across the floor. Jack leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. He tried to remember what life felt like before every sound carried weight, before every shadow made his chest tighten. The therapist at the VA once told him that time heals what memory allows, but Jack no longer believed in time. He believed in days, survived, one after another. Ranger shifted beside him, curling into a tight circle on the rug. The faint sound of the creek outside blended with the dog's slow breathing. Jack let the rhythm settle him. His thoughts drifted to the small town, to the nameless roads that led beyond it, to the horizon that called without promise. He wondered if he would ever stop moving, if there was still a place quiet enough to let his mind rest. He didn't know yet that the place was waiting for him, hidden beyond the hills, where the wind carried the same scent of dry leaves and old wood, and where he and Ranger would soon find the beginning of something unexpected. That night, before he turned off the lamp, Jack walked to the window. The reflection stared back at him, the worn jacket, the tired eyes, the man who had survived but never learned how to live. He reached down, scratched Ranger behind the ear once more, and whispered softly, "Tomorrow we find work again. Tomorrow we keep moving." The dog's tail thumped once, the steady sound of agreement. Jack set his cup in the sink, the clink echoing through the quiet cabin. He lay on the bed, boots still on, Ranger settling at his feet. The wind outside brushed the eaves like a memory trying to speak. For the first time in weeks, Jack's breathing slowed before sleep came. The night carried him gently, and somewhere beyond the open fields, autumn kept whispering its promise of change. The morning mist hung low over the valley, pale and soft like breath against glass. The air was cool but gentle, touched by the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight tried to push through the haze, scattering into gold dust that floated above the road. Jack Walker drove with the window half open, the wind tugging lightly at his brown jacket as the tires rolled over a carpet of red leaves. The old truck rattled inside, its engine steady but tired, just like him. Beside him sat Ranger, his ears perked, eyes sharp and steady, watching every turn in the winding road ahead. Jack had heard about Maple Hollow that morning at the diner, a small place on the edge of town where the coffee was always burnt and the eggs always overcooked. The waitress who told him was a woman named Claire. She was in her early 50s, tall and thin, her blonde hair tied back in a loose knot, the corners of her eyes touched by years of laughter and worry. Her voice had the gentle rasp of someone who smoked too many cigarettes, but still managed to smile for every stranger. Claire had told him in a quiet tone that there was land for sale up north. Cheap land, almost free, in a place nobody wanted anymore. "They say it is cursed," she said, wiping the counter with a damp towel. "Chemical spill back in the 80s. Folks packed up overnight, left their plates on the tables, never came back." Jack listened, silent as usual, his coffee cooling in his hands. He asked how much. She shrugged. Last she heard, the whole stretch of Maple Hollow was going for less than $1,000. Then she leaned closer, her voice low. "The soil is supposed to be bad, poisoned, they say, but who knows anymore? Time has a way of washing sins clean." Jack thanked her, left a few bills on the counter, and stepped out into the thin morning air. He had no plan. Not really. Just a direction. Maple Hollow. The name stayed with him, rolling through his thoughts as he drove. The farther north he went, the thinner the signs of life became. Gas stations grew scarce. Houses sat empty behind fences, overrun with weeds. The road climbed into the hills, winding through groves of maple trees that burned red and amber under the pale light. The world felt suspended between life and sleep. Inside the cab, Ranger shifted, his paws pressing against the seat as he looked out the window. The dog's breath left faint fog on the glass. Jack glanced at him, smiling faintly. "You smell it too, don't you?" The dog's ears flicked. Jack's tone carried no question, just the quiet recognition between two creatures used to reading each other without words. By noon, the road narrowed and the forest thickened. The sun hung lower, its gold turning almost copper through the mist. When the first sign appeared, Jack slowed. The metal plate leaned crooked on one post, its paint long gone except for faint letters spelling Maple Hollow, established 1908. A second sign hung below, rusted and dented, warning in faded red letters, "Do not enter, contaminated soil." Jack turned off the engine. The sound of the world returned, the sigh of wind through leaves, the distant caw of a crow, the soft drip of moisture from the trees. He stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The smell hit him first, dry soil and old wood, but underneath it something else, a sweetness, faint and strange, like fruit long fallen from the tree. Ranger jumped down, sniffing the ground, tail low but calm. His nose traced invisible lines through the air as he moved in slow circles. Jack followed, watching the way the dog paused, listened, and then sat back on his haunches. It was Ranger's way of saying safe enough. The town stretched below, cradled between the hills. Roofs slumped under moss and broken shingles. Windows gaped empty, glass long gone. A church steeple leaned like an old man trying to remember how to stand straight. The lumber mill was nothing more than a rib cage of beams and shadows. Telephone poles tilted at tired angles, wires drooping like forgotten strings. Everything was silent, yet Jack could almost hear what had been. Footsteps on porches, children laughing, the hum of saws. The echo of life still clung here, thin as mist. He walked slowly down the cracked main street, Ranger at his side. Weeds pushed through the pavement in wild, stubborn lines. A rusted bicycle leaned against a lamppost, its frame eaten by time. A sign above a boarded window read, "Palmer's Groceries." The letters faded, but still visible beneath the grime. Jack stopped there, resting his hand on the doorframe. The wood felt soft and cold. A gust of wind swept down the street, carrying with it a swirl of yellow leaves. Jack looked up, watching them drift between the buildings. For a moment, it felt as if the town was breathing again. He thought about what Claire had said. Time washes sins clean. Maybe that was true. Maybe the land only needed someone willing to listen again. He returned to the truck and sat on the step, staring out at the empty street. The place was broken, yes, but not dead. He'd seen real death, felt it, smelled it, carried it. This was something different. This was waiting. Ranger settled beside him, resting his head on Jack's boot. The silence wrapped around them like a blanket, heavy but not hostile. Jack's hands rested on his knees. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, the air cold in his chest. He thought about the apartment he had left behind, the narrow bed, the constant noise of the city. He thought about Luke Turner, about the way his friend had gripped his wrist in that final moment, whispering, "Find a place where the silence does not hurt." Jack had laughed then, bitter and broken, thinking no such place existed. But sitting here now, with the wind moving softly through the hollow and the dog breathing steady beside him, he felt something shift. The silence did not hurt. Not here. Not yet. The afternoon light turned honey-colored as it slipped between the trees. Jack stood and walked toward what had once been the post office. Inside, dust drifted like slow snow. An overturned desk lay in the corner, papers scattered and yellowed with age. On the wall, a calendar still clung by one pin, its month frozen in September 1983. He touched the edge of it, then stepped back outside. Ranger waited, ears tilted forward, body tense but calm. Jack looked around once more, taking in the hollow, the buildings, the rusted signs, the curve of the road leading in and out. He could have left then. He should have. But he didn't. Something in him, something he had buried deep, told him to stay. He climbed into the truck, started the engine, and drove a slow circle through the heart of the town. The tires crunched over gravel and glass. The echo of the sound carried through the valley, the first voice it had heard in decades. At the far end, near the remains of the sawmill, Jack stopped again. The structure stood half collapsed, the metal roof caved in, the sign barely hanging from a single chain. He stepped out once more. The setting sun hit the tin panels, casting a warm glow that made the ruins almost beautiful. Ranger padded forward, sniffing near a pile of broken boards, then sat down. His eyes met Jack's, calm and certain. Jack crouched beside him, resting a hand on his neck. "You think this could be home, boy?" Ranger blinked slowly, then leaned his head against Jack's arm. The wind picked up again, sweeping through the hollow. The golden leaves spiraled through the air, and somewhere beyond the hills, a bell clanged faintly, long and low, as if the town itself was answering. Jack smiled, the first true smile in months. He stood and looked around one last time. The air shimmered faintly in the setting sun, the mist turning to gold. The silence felt different now, not empty, but full of promise. He took a deep breath and said quietly to the dog beside him, "All right, Ranger, we stay." Ranger's tail brushed the ground once, a quiet agreement. Together, they turned toward the fading light, two silhouettes framed by the soft haze of autumn, standing in the middle of a town the world had forgotten, but not yet lost. The night settled over Maple Hollow like a soft gray blanket. The air was crisp, but not cruel, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and rusted metal. A silver moon climbed slow and pale above the broken roofs, and the wind whispered through the hollowed buildings with the hush of something ancient remembering itself. Inside the old sawmill, where the floorboards groaned and the roof sagged in the middle, Jack Walker sat near the faint glow of a small fire. The flames licked the air quietly, throwing light on his weathered jacket and the rough planes of his face. He had cleaned the space as best he could, sweeping away years of dust and broken nails. The smell of pine still clung faintly to the walls, mixed with the damp scent of rust and decay. He had dragged an old cot from the corner, its frame bent but usable, and spread his blanket over it. His duffel sat nearby, a reminder of how little he carried, how much he had already left behind. Ranger lay beside the fire, his fur shimmering gold and black in the shifting light. The dog's breathing was slow and steady, his ears twitching occasionally at sounds only he could hear. Every now and then, he would lift his head and glance at Jack as if to check that the man was still there. Jack reached down, his fingers brushing the coarse fur between Ranger's ears, grounding himself in the warmth of that familiar life. It was his first night in Maple Hollow, and though the silence should have been comforting, it felt heavy instead. The kind of silence that holds too many memories. The kind that makes the past louder than the wind. He leaned back against the wall, his shoulders aching from the day's work and the long drive before it. The air carried a faint metallic chill. Each gust through the cracks in the wall made the fire flicker and his skin tighten. Jack tried to focus on the small rhythm of normal things, the popping of the fire, the dog's steady breath, the soft rustle of leaves outside. But his mind, trained for years to listen for danger, caught every whisper and twist of the air. It was always like that at night. Even after the war, his body never fully learned that silence could mean safety. He thought of the desert again, the endless brightness that left no shadows to hide in. He remembered the sound of the sand against the metal hull of a transport, the taste of dust, the weight of the helmet pressing against his temples. And then, as if his thoughts had conjured it, the memory came, sharp, bright, and unwelcome. The explosion, the sound of shattering light, the world folding in on itself. Luke Turner's voice yelling his name. Then nothing but ringing, the kind that lived in his bones for years. Jack's eyes snapped open. The firelight seemed too bright. His breath came quick and shallow. His palms were slick. He could almost smell the smoke, could almost hear the screams rising over the wind. He pushed himself up, stumbling to his feet, chest tight, as if the air itself had turned against him. Ranger was on his feet instantly. The dog moved close, pressing against Jack's leg. The warmth of him cut through the cold air. Jack knelt, his hands trembling as he gripped the dog's neck. It was all muscle under that thick fur, solid and steady. The dog's heartbeat pulsed against his fingers. Jack focused on it, counted it, matched his breathing to it. Slowly, the room began to come back into focus. The sawmill, the fire, the soft creak of old wood. Jack closed his eyes, his forehead resting against Ranger's. He whispered low, the words rough but gentle. "You are the reason I am still here." The dog shifted closer, pressing his head under Jack's chin, as if he understood. For a long moment, they stayed like that. The night moved quietly around them. The moonlight spilled through the gaps in the roof, painting the floor in patches of silver. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes from the hills. A rusted sign swaying, a loose shutter tapping against the wall of an empty house. The hollow was not dead after all. It was breathing, just slower than the rest of the world. When the worst of it passed, Jack stood and fed another small log into the fire. His hands had stopped shaking, though his chest still ached from the memory. He sat again, his back to the wall, and watched the flames move. He remembered what one of his old officers had told him once, during a night much like this, halfway around the world. You can fight a man, or you can fight a war, but you cannot fight what stays inside you. Jack had laughed then. He did not laugh now. He looked at Ranger, now stretched on the floor, head resting on his paws. The dog's eyes were open, watching him quietly. Jack smiled faintly. You keep watch, do you not? The dog's tail thumped once. Jack took a deep breath. The smell of wood smoke reminded him of nights long before the war. Nights when his father would build fires behind their old farmhouse and talk about the way the seasons turned. His father had been a simple man, a carpenter with hands cracked by work and a heart too big for his own good. Jack had inherited the hands, maybe not the heart. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the stiffness from too many nights without rest. He wondered what his father would think if he could see him now, sitting in a ruined town with a dog for company, chasing ghosts instead of peace. The thought should have hurt, but it did not. Maybe because for the first time in years, he was not running. Outside, a sound rose faintly through the hollow, a low howl of wind moving between the buildings. It almost sounded like a voice. Jack tilted his head, listening, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Still, the sound lingered in him, stirring something he could not quite name. It was not fear, not anymore. Maybe it was recognition. He leaned his head back and watched the light shift on the ceiling. Through the open cracks, he could see stars blinking in and out of the drifting clouds. The fire burned low, the embers glowing soft red. Ranger shifted again, moving closer until his side pressed against Jack's boots. The man reached down, resting a hand there, the contact steadying him again. He thought of the long road that had led him here, the cities and faces that blurred together, the way every job had felt temporary, every sunrise just another repetition of the last. But here, in this forgotten town, there was something different in the quiet. It was not just emptiness. It was space. Space to start again, if he had the courage to try. He looked at the old walls, at the way the moonlight painted silver lines through the cracks, and he thought about how many storms this place had already survived. Maybe that was why it called to him. It was broken, yes, but still standing. So was he. Jack pulled the blanket over his shoulders and lay back on the cot. Ranger circled once, then lay down beside him. The dog's body curved to match his. The warmth between them was enough to push back the chill. The world outside faded into stillness again. Before sleep came, Jack spoke once more, his voice low, almost lost to the wind. "We stay, Ranger. Tomorrow we start making this place ours." The dog lifted his head briefly, his amber eyes catching the light, and then he sighed, settling back down. The fire dimmed to embers. The hollow sighed once more, its breath passing through the broken eaves and into the night. And under that soft, endless whisper, Jack finally slept. Not without dreams, but with the faintest sense that this time the echoes might lead him somewhere worth finding. The morning air of Maple Hollow was cool and thin, touched by the sweetness of drying leaves. A soft mist hung low over the ground, and the first light of the sun filtered through the golden haze. The world felt still, fragile, almost new. Jack Walker stood outside the old sawmill, stretching his arms, the smell of wood smoke still clinging to his jacket. The fire from last night had burned out, leaving only faint traces of ash. Ranger trotted nearby, nose close to the ground, tail swaying in quiet rhythm. The wind carried the distant sound of a truck on the road, breaking the silence like a memory returning. By the time Jack looked up, the sound had grown closer. A small blue pickup came into view, old but well kept, its paint dulled by years of use. It slowed as it approached the mill and came to a stop by the gate. The engine cut off, and a woman stepped out, carrying a basket covered with a clean white cloth. Jack watched her for a moment, uncertain whether to wave or wait. The woman was in her late 40s, tall and graceful, though her movements showed the wear of long workdays. Her hair was chestnut brown, streaked faintly with silver, tied loosely at the back. Her skin carried the warmth of someone used to sunlight and open air, and her eyes were gray like morning fog, calm but not cold. She wore a pale green coat buttoned up to the collar and a long wool skirt that brushed against her boots. There was a simple steadiness in the way she walked, the kind that comes from surviving loss without losing gentleness. "Morning," she said, her voice carrying a softness that matched the light around them. "You must be the man everyone's been whispering about in town." Jack smiled faintly. "Depends on what they're whispering," he said. She laughed quietly, the sound light and natural. She introduced herself as Linda Brooks from Cedar Ridge, a small town a few miles west. She explained that she ran the bakery there, and every few weeks she delivered bread to the nearby farms, or what was left of them. She had heard from a friend at the diner that someone had moved into Maple Hollow. Most thought it was a rumor, but she said curiosity got the better of her. She set the basket down on the tailgate of Jack's truck and lifted the cloth. The smell of fresh bread rose immediately, warm and inviting. Beneath it sat a small jar of creamy potato stew, sealed tight. The steam still clung faintly to the lid. "I thought you might need something hot this morning," she said. "It gets colder up here than people remember." Jack hesitated before answering. It had been a long time since anyone had offered him kindness without reason. He nodded slowly. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." Linda tilted her head slightly, studying him. Her expression softened, but her tone stayed steady. Nobody deserves kindness. They just need it sometimes. Ranger had been watching the exchange quietly. The dog stood beside Jack, tail wagging once in polite greeting. Linda crouched, down, hand extended. Ranger sniffed her fingers, then leaned slightly forward, letting her scratch behind his ear. His eyes half closed, tail moving in slow approval. "He's beautiful," she said. "German Shepherd." "Right." Jack nodded. "His name's Ranger. Been with me since the service." Linda looked up at him. "So, you're a veteran?" Jack said nothing at first, then answered simply, "Used to be." For a few moments, they both stood in silence, the sound of the wind passing softly through the hollowed buildings. Linda looked around, taking in the place. Her gaze lingered on the broken sign above the old sawmill and the way the trees had begun to reclaim the edges of the road. "This land used to be something," she said. "My father came here once when I was a girl. He said the people of Maple Hollow were proud, maybe too proud. Then the chemicals came, the factory spill, and fear did the rest. No one ever came back. They said the ground was poisoned." She paused, looking back at him. "You shouldn't stay here too long." Jack met her eyes, and for a moment the tiredness behind them softened. "I don't have anywhere else left to be afraid of," he said. Something in his tone silenced her. It wasn't defiance, just truth, the kind that leaves no room for argument. Linda looked at him for a long time, then nodded slowly. She pulled her coat tighter as the wind picked up. She left the basket on the tailgate and turned toward her truck. Before climbing in, she said, "I bake on Thursdays. If you ever pass through Cedar Ridge, stop by. Bread's on the house for soldiers." Jack nodded, unsure if he'd ever take her up on it, but the thought stayed with him. When the sound of her truck faded into the trees, the hollow felt quiet again, but not as empty as before. The smell of bread lingered, warm and sweet against the cool air. Jack carried the basket inside, set it near the fire pit, and broke a piece of bread in half. It was soft and still warm in the middle. He handed a piece to Ranger, who took it gently between his teeth, tail sweeping the floor. After breakfast, Jack stepped outside again. The mist had begun to lift, leaving thin trails of gold light cutting across the broken road. Ranger wandered near the edge of the mill, nose to the ground, sniffing with curiosity. Suddenly, he began to dig, his paws moving fast, throwing small clumps of dry dirt behind him. Jack watched for a moment, then knelt to help. His fingers brushed something solid and metallic. Together, they unearthed a small tin box, rusted and dented, but still sealed tight. Jack pried it open carefully. Inside were a few old photographs, corners curled and edges yellowed. The top one showed a group of smiling people standing beneath a sign that read, "Maple Hollow Rebuild." They were holding shovels, paintbrushes, and hope. The sky in the picture was bright and clear, the kind of day that looks like a promise. Jack stared at the faces. Some were young, some older, all filled with life. He turned the photo over, but there were no names written on the back. He held it up to the light, and for a brief moment, it seemed as if the laughter in that picture still lived somewhere in the air. He placed the photo back in the box and set it beside the wall. Ranger sat beside him, tilting his head as if waiting for a sign. Jack reached over and rubbed the dog's neck. "You see this, boy? They tried once. Maybe we can too." The sun climbed higher, and the mist finally burned away. The broken town glowed under the golden light. For the first time, Jack did not see only what was lost. He saw what had been, and what might still be. The afternoon sky was streaked with long clouds that moved fast above the valley. The wind carried the smell of dry grass and wood dust, rushing through Maple Hollow with restless hands. The light was sharp and golden, turning the broken windows into mirrors and the leaves into a storm of amber. Jack Walker stood near the edge of the sawmill yard, his jacket tugged by the gusts, his mind as unsettled as the air. He had spent the morning repairing the roof beams with what little he had, his hands raw and stained with rust. Beside him, Ranger watched in silence, head tilted, eyes following every movement as if the dog knew something was coming. The sound reached them first, not from the wind, but from the road. Tires grinding over gravel, voices raised over the roar of the air. Jack turned, wiping the sweat from his neck with his sleeve. A black pickup truck rolled into view, its paint polished but dusted by the drive. 3 men climbed out, the wind pushing at their coats. The one in front walked with a swagger that did not hide his anger. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hair the color of ash blonde, slicked back with oil. His jaw was strong, his nose slightly crooked, and his eyes a cold blue that did not match the warmth of the afternoon light. Travis Morrison. The name came to Jack's mind before the man spoke. He had heard it once in passing at the diner, from a mechanic who mentioned the Morrison family with a kind of careful respect. The Morrisons had owned the factory that once fed Maple Hollow, and when it spilled poison into the soil, they left before the dust settled. Now the factory stood in ruin, and the Morrison name lived on in bitterness and rumor. Travis stopped a few feet away, boots crunching on the gravel. Behind him were 2 younger men, one lean and quiet, the other with the restless energy of youth. The quiet one was his cousin Dale, a man in his mid-30s with dark eyes and a scar across his cheek, the kind that spoke of bar fights and poor decisions. The youngest was his brother Ethan, barely 20, tall but not yet hardened by the world. His face still carried the softness of boyhood beneath the bravado he tried to wear. Travis folded his arms, his voice cutting through the wind. "You the man who's been telling people my father's factory poisoned this land." Jack met his gaze calmly. "I'm the man living here. That's all." Travis smirked. "Then you should be careful what stories you dig up. This place is none of your concern." Jack took a slow breath. The wind picked up again, scattering leaves between them. He could feel Ranger tense beside him, the dog's stance shifting low, ready but not aggressive. Jack's voice stayed even. "I'm not digging for stories, just trying to build a roof over my head." Travis took a step closer, his boots echoing on the cracked pavement. "My family's been blamed for this town dying," he said, his tone sharp. "I won't let some drifter use my name to feed his pity." Jack felt something stir in his chest, not anger, but the weight of too many years of accusation and loss. His voice came quiet but firm. "You think I care about your name? I'm just trying to breathe in a place that still remembers how." Ethan shifted behind his brother, glancing uneasily at the sawmill beams above. He looked at Jack with less hostility, his eyes uncertain. The wind howled again, stronger this time, rattling the tin roof and shaking loose a few brittle planks. Travis ignored it, stepping closer still, his voice rising. "You don't belong here. Nobody does. The wind's been dead for years until you showed up stirring ghosts." The gust came hard and sudden. The old beams above groaned. Jack looked up instinctively. He heard the crack before he saw it. A long, splintering sound tore through the air, as one of the roof timbers gave way. In that second, time stretched thin. A shadow fell across the yard, and Ethan, standing beneath the frame, froze. Jack moved before thinking. He shouted once, his voice swallowed by the wind, and ran forward. His boot slammed against the boards as he reached the boy. He caught Ethan by the shoulder and shoved him aside just as the beam fell. The impact hit his own shoulder like a hammer. Pain exploded through his arm, but he pushed against the weight, his muscles straining. Ranger barked, sharp and commanding, circling close, but staying clear of the debris. The dog's body was rigid, his ears pinned back, every sense focused on Jack. Dale ran forward then, his anger forgotten. He grabbed the other end of the timber. Together, they heaved, the wood groaning as it lifted enough for Jack to pull Ethan free. The boy gasped, coughing in the dust. When it was done, Jack sank to one knee, clutching his shoulder. The air was thick with the smell of old pine and rust. Travis stood frozen a few feet away, the fight drained from his face. For the first time, he looked less like a man protecting pride and more like one realizing how easily life can break. Ethan turned to Jack, his voice trembling. "You saved me." Jack shook his head, his breath still heavy. "Just moved faster than I thought I could." Dale knelt beside them, his hands shaking. Travis took a long step forward, his blue eyes searching Jack's face for something he couldn't name. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of its sharpness. "My father built that mill. Said it would make the town proud." Jack met his gaze. "Maybe it still can, if someone remembers it right." For a long moment, the wind slowed, as if the valley itself was catching its breath. The sunlight broke through the clouds again, turning the drifting dust to gold. Ranger sat between them, his fur shining in the light, his eyes calm and watchful. Travis looked down at his brother, then back at Jack. His jaw clenched once, but not in anger, more in shame. He reached out his hand. Jack hesitated, then took it. The grip was firm, the kind of handshake that ends something and begins something else. "We'll get that beam fixed," Travis said. "My father's tools are still in the shed down the road." Jack nodded. He looked toward the trees, where the leaves spun like sparks in the wind. When they left, the air felt lighter. The anger that had filled the hollow seemed to fade with the sound of the truck disappearing into the hills. Jack sat down on the step of the sawmill, his arm throbbing but steady. Ranger came to his side and rested his head on Jack's knee. The dog's eyes were bright, reflecting the soft light of late afternoon. "You did good today," Jack said quietly. Ranger's tail brushed against the dirt once, slow and steady. The wind shifted again, but this time it carried no threat. Only the smell of dry leaves and something faintly sweet, like the promise of rain. Jack leaned back, eyes half closed, the pain in his shoulder fading into the warmth of the setting sun. Somewhere above, a few leaves broke loose from the trees, turning in the golden light before falling to rest. For the first time, the wind sounded less like a warning and more like forgiveness. The next morning dawned with soft golden light resting on the tin roofs of Maple Hollow. The air was cool but gentle, the kind of calm that follows a storm. Leaves rustled across the open road, brushing against old fences and fallen boards. Jack Walker stepped out of the sawmill, his breath forming thin clouds in the morning air. His shoulder still ached from yesterday, but the pain had become a quiet reminder of something gained rather than lost. Ranger trotted ahead, nose close to the ground, ears perked tail swaying in steady rhythm. The dog stopped at the edge of the road and barked once, low and brief, before glancing back at Jack as if to say someone was coming. A moment later, the sound of an engine broke the silence. A dusty pickup truck rolled down the path, sunlight glinting off its windshield. Travis Morrison sat behind the wheel, his jaw tense, eyes fixed on the sawmill. In the truck bed were planks of lumber, a bucket of nails, and a coiled length of rope. Beside him sat Dale, face still marked by a fading bruise from the accident, his usual roughness replaced with quiet determination. In the back sat two local men Jack hadn't met before, both wearing work coats and heavy gloves, their faces lined from years under the sun. Travis stopped the truck and stepped out, his boots crunching against gravel. He wore a worn leather jacket and a look that seemed caught somewhere between pride and humility. The man who had come angry yesterday now looked like someone trying to make peace with himself. "Morning," he said. "Thought I'd bring what I promised." Jack nodded. The words felt heavier than they should. Carrying an apology, neither man wanted to speak aloud. They began unloading the lumber, working side by side in silence at first. The sound of wood meeting earth echoed softly under the bright sky. Dale was the first to speak, his voice low and gruff. "This place has a good frame, just needs hands that care." Jack glanced at him and saw that the scar on his cheek caught the light, turning pale against his tanned skin. Dale was not a man of easy words, but his tone carried quiet respect. Jack replied simply, "Then let's see what we can build." As the men set to work, Ranger circled around them, alert but content. The dog sniffed every plank as if inspecting it for safety, then settled nearby, tail sweeping the dirt whenever someone laughed or spoke kindly. His fur glowed under the sunlight, and every time the hammer struck, his ears twitched, but he stayed calm. He seemed to sense that today was different, that the noise was no longer a threat. An hour into the work, another sound joined the rhythm of hammer and wind, the faint hum of an approaching car. Jack looked up to see a familiar blue sedan turning the corner, dust rising behind it. The door opened, and Linda Brooks stepped out, holding a thermos and a small basket. She wore a tan coat over a light dress, her hair pinned loosely at the back, wisps catching the light. Her cheeks were touched pink by the wind, and her smile was the kind that made the air seem warmer. "Brought coffee," she said, walking toward them. "Thought you could use something that isn't sawdust and stubbornness." Travis turned, unsure how to respond. His face softened slightly when he recognized her. Linda Brooks, the baker from Cedar Ridge. He had bought bread from her once years ago, when his father was still alive. Linda greeted him with a nod and handed him a cup. Her movements were simple, practiced, like someone used to taking care of others without asking for anything back. She poured for each man in turn, the steam curling in the cold air. When she reached Jack, she smiled faintly. "You're looking better than yesterday," he replied quietly. "Maybe the world decided to stop fighting me for a while." She tilted her head. "Or maybe you stopped fighting it." The men drank in silence, the bitter warmth spreading through their hands, the scent of coffee mixed with pine and sawdust, filling the air with something familiar, almost homely. For the first time, laughter began to rise among them, small at first, then louder, breaking the stillness that had once ruled Maple Hollow. Dale told a clumsy joke about nails and ghosts. Even Travis cracked a smile, though he tried to hide it. When the break ended, They went back to work. Jack climbed a ladder, driving nails into the upper frame while Travis steadied the beam below. Their movements fell into rhythm. Each swing of the hammer sounded less like labor and more like music. The sawmill, once silent for decades, now sang with the sound of rebuilding. Linda sat nearby on an old crate, watching them as she tore small pieces of bread for Ranger. The dog accepted each gently, eyes half closed in pleasure. The light danced across her face, and for a moment, Jack caught himself watching her. There was something grounding in her presence, something that reminded him that life was not only about surviving, but about returning to it. By midday, the roof stood half restored, the gaps patched with new boards that caught the sunlight. Sweat streaked their foreheads, and their clothes smelled of effort and pine. Travis stood back, looking at the structure with quiet awe. He exhaled slowly. "My father would have liked this," he said. Jack looked over. "Then let it be something he'd be proud of." For a moment, their eyes met, and the wind carried the sound of rustling leaves between them. The tension that had once filled the air was gone. What remained was work, purpose, and a fragile kind of peace. Linda clapped her hands once, smiling. "If anyone wants more coffee, there's still some left, though it might be stronger than your pride." The men laughed, and the sound rolled through the hollow like a bell. Even Ranger barked once, as if joining in. As the sun began its slow descent, the yard glowed with amber light. The sawmill stood taller now, no longer a ruin, but a promise. Jack stood at the doorway, looking out across the valley. The trees swayed in the wind, and their leaves shimmered gold. He felt something he had not felt in years, a sense that the world, broken as it was, could still heal. Travis came to stand beside him. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You know, maybe this place wasn't cursed after all. Maybe it was just waiting." Jack nodded, waiting for someone to listen. They stood there in silence while the others packed up their tools. Ranger sat between them, tail brushing against the boards, head high, eyes reflecting the sunset. The sound of the hammers faded, replaced by the steady hum of wind and laughter echoing through Maple Hollow. The valley, once quiet as a grave, now breathed again. Jack turned toward Linda, who was loading her empty basket into her car. "Thank you," he said. She smiled. "I didn't build anything." He shook his head. "You built the morning." The wind stirred, carrying with it the scent of coffee and sawdust, of work and forgiveness. The light fell softly across the town, and for the first time, it felt alive again. The morning came bright and soft, the kind of autumn light that carried warmth without heat. The mist had lifted early, leaving the valley clear and wide beneath a pale blue sky. Dew shimmered on the grass, and the sound of distant birds echoed faintly through the trees. Jack Walker stood near the stream behind the old sawmill, the same stream that once carried the whispers of fear through Maple Hollow. The water glistened, catching sunlight like scattered glass. He crouched down, dipped his hand into the current, and felt its calm coldness run through his fingers. Ranger stood beside him, tail wagging lightly, his reflection rippling across the surface. The air smelled of pine and earth, and for the first time, there was no bitterness in it. From the road came the low hum of an approaching car. Jack rose, brushing the dirt from his jeans, and turned toward the sound. A small silver hatchback rolled to a stop near the sawmill. The driver's door opened, and a young woman stepped out, holding a clipboard and a small case. She looked to be in her late 20s, dressed neatly in a pale blue field jacket, khaki trousers, and brown hiking boots. Her hair was auburn, pulled back into a loose ponytail that glowed in the light. Her skin was fair, her face open and bright, with eyes the color of green glass, sharp but kind. She carried herself with an easy confidence, the sort born from long days outdoors and a quiet belief in her work. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and even. "You must be Mr. Walker. I'm Emily Carter, from the State Environmental Agency. I was sent to test the water here in Maple Hollow." Jack nodded, gesturing toward the stream. "You came at a good time. It's clearer than it's been in years." Emily smiled, kneeling by the bank. She unpacked a small kit, the metal latches clicking softly. Her movements were precise, practiced. She filled a vial with water, shook it gently, and held it against the light. Then she dipped a thin strip of testing paper, waited, and watched as the color shifted from pale yellow to clean white. A breeze passed through, scattering a few leaves across the stream. Ranger sniffed one and sneezed, making her laugh. She reached out and scratched behind his ear. "And who's this fine inspector?" Jack smiled faintly. "That's Ranger. He's been keeping the place in line longer than I have." Emily continued her work in silence, taking notes and checking each reading twice. After a while, she stood, brushing off her knees. "Well, that's something," she said. "The water's clean, completely. No trace of chemicals, no residue. Whatever poisoned this land has been gone a long time." Jack looked at her for a long moment. The words didn't seem real at first. For years, Maple Hollow had been a place people whispered about, a name tied to fear and abandonment. To hear it declared safe felt like lifting a weight from the earth itself. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. Emily nodded, her voice steady. "As sure as science allows. This place isn't sick anymore, Mr. Walker. It just needs people to believe in it again." The news spread faster than the wind. Travis arrived by noon, his truck kicking up dust along the road. Behind him came two more vehicles, Linda's blue sedan and another truck carrying lumber and supplies. Word had reached Cedar Ridge and beyond, carried by voices that hadn't spoken of Maple Hollow in years. They came not out of curiosity, but out of a quiet hope that maybe the land they once feared could still be home. By afternoon, the hollow was alive with sound. Travis and Dale began cutting new boards to replace the damaged siding of the sawmill. Their shirts clung to their backs with sweat, their hands moving with practiced rhythm. Linda set up a small table beneath a tree, her apron tied around her waist, the smell of fresh bread and coffee filling the air. Ranger trotted between them, occasionally stopping by to watch, tail swaying in quiet approval. Someone called him the four-legged guard of Maple Hollow, and the name stuck. Every time he barked, the men joked that he was issuing orders. Emily stayed by the stream, taking final notes as the sunlight moved across the water. When she finished, she joined them at the sawmill. Her voice was bright as she shared the news aloud, explaining the details to the small crowd that had gathered. The soil and water had naturally restored over the years. The fear had lasted longer than the danger. Jack listened from the doorway. Around him, the sounds of saws and hammers mingled with laughter. The noise was different from any he'd known. It was the sound of people returning, of walls being rebuilt, of purpose taking root again. His heart felt full in a way it hadn't in decades. As the sun began to dip, The light turned honey gold, washing the hollow in warmth. The stream reflected the sky, and the trees glowed like embers. Travis stood beside Jack, wiping his hands with a rag. "You know," he said, "maybe this place isn't cursed after all." Jack looked toward the water. It never was. It was just waiting for us to stop being afraid. Linda called everyone over for supper. She had laid out loaves of bread, roasted potatoes, and mugs of hot coffee. The air buzzed with voices. Emily sat cross-legged on a bench, notebook resting on her knee, smiling as she watched people share stories. Ranger sat at her feet, his head tilted up, waiting for a piece of bread he knew she couldn't resist giving him. When darkness began to settle, Travis lit a lantern and hung it by the door. Its glow spread across the faces gathered near, casting long, soft shadows. Someone started humming an old tune, and before long, others joined. It wasn't a song of triumph, but something quieter, something that belonged to people who had lost much, but still stood. Jack sat back, his gaze lifting to the stars that had begun to pierce the twilight. The ache in his shoulder was still there, but it felt distant, almost like proof of survival. He reached down and rested his hand on Ranger's head. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes half closed, the steady hum of the night surrounding them both. The sound of the stream carried through the quiet. It ran clean and clear, reflecting lantern light like scattered gold. For the first time since he had come to Maple Hollow, Jack felt peace settle deep inside him. The land had healed, the people had returned, and the wind no longer sounded like sorrow. The last days of autumn came quietly, carrying a softness that only time could weave. The air was cool but gentle, and the light of the afternoon spread across Maple Hollow like warm honey. The trees that once stood bare now held streaks of gold and rust, their leaves scattered over the path that wound past the sawmill and down toward the wooden bridge. The sound of distant laughter and the faint rhythm of hammer and saw still drifted through the valley, blending with the whisper of the wind. Jack Walker sat on the front step of the rebuilt shed, his elbows resting on his knees, watching the light play across the grain of the new wood. His brown jacket was frayed at the cuffs, and his jeans carried patches of dust and sawdust. His hair, hazel and streaked faintly with silver, moved gently in the breeze. Beside him, Ranger lay stretched out, his fur touched with gray along the muzzle, his eyes half closed in contentment. The dog's chest rose and fell in slow rhythm, a picture of peace that matched the stillness of the land around them. The shed that once stood as a ruin was now something entirely new. Its walls were solid, windows repaired, the roof lined with shingles that caught the sunlight in warm hues. Over the door hung a hand-painted sign that read, "Ranger's Shed." Beneath it, small carvings and initials marked the contributions of those who had helped rebuild it. The place had become more than a shelter. It was now a workshop and gathering hall where people came to learn, to work, to mend. From inside came the sound of saws and laughter. A few men were planing down old boards to make benches, while others arranged tools along the walls. Among them was Travis Morrison. Sleeves rolled to his elbows, his blonde hair tousled from the long day's work. His movements were firm but patient, his expression softer than it had once been. There was a steadiness in him now, born from humility and a kind of quiet pride. Near the workbench stood Dale, his scarred face turned slightly toward the light filtering through the window. He had taken to teaching some of the younger men from nearby towns, showing them how to handle tools safely, his rough voice carrying traces of kindness that had been buried for years. Linda Brooks moved about the yard with a basket of loaves wrapped in cloth. Her tan coat was open at the front, revealing a red scarf that caught the afternoon glow. Her chestnut hair shimmered faintly in the sunlight as she handed bread to the workers. She had grown thinner over the months, but her eyes were brighter, alive with a spark of purpose. She had begun delivering food twice a week to those who came to help rebuild, and her laughter had become a familiar sound in Maple Hollow. Emily Carter sat a few yards away, near the bridge, her camera balanced in her hands. The young researcher had traded her state uniform for a simple cream sweater and jeans, though she still carried the same quiet precision in everything she did. Her auburn hair gleamed in the golden light, and she smiled as she looked through the viewfinder. She had promised to document Maple Hollow's renewal for the agency, but it had become more than a report. It was a promise to herself, a record of how life returns when people choose to believe. Jack watched them all with a calm that settled deep within him. The ache in his shoulder had faded, though he could still feel it faintly when the wind changed. It no longer felt like pain, but like memory, a reminder of the moment when everything began to turn. His hands were calloused from months of labor, yet they were steady. For the first time in years, he no longer felt like a man waiting to leave. He had found a place that asked nothing of him except to stay. Ranger stirred beside him, stretching before lifting his head. His ears twitched at the sound of voices, and his eyes followed the movement near the bridge. There, Travis stood speaking with Linda, gesturing toward the repaired walkway. The wooden planks glowed under the low sun, and their reflections shimmered in the water below. Linda laughed softly at something he said, and the sound carried up the path like a note in a song. Emily raised her camera, framing the moment, the lens catching the warm tones of their faces against the fading light. Jack smiled faintly as he watched them. The image before him felt like a story that no one had needed to tell him, one that life itself had written through kindness and persistence. He looked down at Ranger, whose gaze remained fixed on the people he had guarded all this time. The dog's eyes, once sharp and watchful, now held a quiet wisdom. Jack reached out and rested his hand gently on the thick fur at Ranger's neck. "We did it, boy," he said softly. His voice barely rose above the rustling of the leaves, but Ranger's ears flicked, and he leaned into the touch, his tail brushing against the wood. The sun had dipped lower, and the light began to scatter in long rays that spilled across the valley. The air shimmered with the faint scent of pine resin and bread. Jack could hear the sound of children laughing down by the bridge. One of the local families had begun bringing their son to learn carpentry. The boy's laughter echoed like a bell, and Dale's rough voice answered him with a patient instruction. As the day drew toward evening, Travis set down his hammer and walked over to Jack. His face was flushed from work, but his expression was calm. "It looks good, does it not?" he said. Jack nodded. "Better than good. It feels right." Travis looked at the shed, the people, the hills behind them. "My father used to say, a place only dies when people stop caring. Guess he was wrong about that too." Jack smiled. Maybe he was just early. Linda joined them a moment later, wiping her hands on her apron. She handed each of them a piece of warm bread, the crust still crisp. The three of them stood quietly, looking over the valley as the sun sank behind the trees. Emily lifted her camera one last time, capturing the way the light caught their faces and how Ranger lay content at their feet. The golden hour stretched on, each second turning softer until the world seemed wrapped in amber. The sound of the wind returned, not as a storm or warning, but as a song. It moved through the leaves and across the water, gentle and steady. Jack took a deep breath, the scent of sawdust and earth filling his lungs. He thought of all the nights he had woken to silence, and now realized that peace had always been waiting for him. It just needed others to hear it too. Ranger yawned, then rested his head on Jack's knee. The last rays of sunlight touched the shed's roof, and the hand-painted sign glowed softly in the fading day. Ranger's shed stood tall against the horizon, a mark of what people could build when they refused to let loss define them. As the first evening star appeared above the ridge, Jack closed his eyes for a moment. The warmth of the light touched his face, and he whispered once more, his voice calm and sure. "We did it, old friend." The wind carried the sound away, blending it with laughter and the faint hum of life returning. Maple Hollow breathed deeply beneath the golden sky, alive again in every sense of the word. As the last light of autumn faded beyond the hills, Maple Hollow stood calm beneath the evening sky. The sound of tools had quieted, but their echoes lived on in every wall that had been raised, every bridge rebuilt, every heart that had chosen to stay. What began as one man's search for peace had become a living story of hope. Jack Walker and Ranger had not only found a home, but they had helped others remember that even forgotten places can bloom again when touched by compassion. The wind that once carried sorrow now carried laughter, and the shed that once stood in ruin had become a beacon of second chances. The true miracle was never in the rebuilding of wood or stone. It was in the way people returned to one another, in the warmth of shared work and simple faith. Perhaps that is how God performs his quiet wonders, not through thunder or signs, but through hands that choose to build, forgive, and love. In the rhythm of a hammer, in the touch of a kind word, in the wag of a loyal dog's tail, grace finds its way back into the world. May those who listen to this story remember that miracles do not always come in shining light, but in the gentle courage to begin again. May your own days be filled with kindness, with purpose, and with peace that comes from believing you are never alone. If this story has touched your heart, share it so others may feel the same warmth. Leave your thoughts in the comments and join this growing circle of hope. Subscribe for more stories of faith, love, and redemption. May God bless you and guide your days with light.